Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, or good morning for most of our panel and anybody who's tuning in from the islands. This is going to be an on-the-record discussion about the impact that COVID-19 is having in the Pacific Islands, which has been a sorely undercovered, I think, especially here in Washington, issue as we think about the pandemic and the US and other outside nation responses to it. We're going to have a great panel, but first a little housekeeping. So as I said, everything that is said today is going to be on the record. This event is being streamed as a Zoom webinar, but we will get the video recorded and up on csis.org and onto YouTube in a day or two and share it pretty widely after that. It's being made possible by generous support from the Embassy of New Zealand. And in a moment, we're going to have opening remarks from Ambassador Rosemary Banks. First, let me give a brief introduction to our panelists. So after the ambassador speaks, you're going to hear first from Dr. Tarsisius Kibutalaka, who is an associate professor and director of the Center for the Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii. Then we're going to hear from Alfred Ohlers. Al is a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies in Honolulu. And then Dr. Anna Powles will close us out and is a senior lecturer in security studies at Massey University in New Zealand. So all of them are joining us from much, much earlier or in the future and hopefully have had time to caffeinate. Before we start the panel discussion, why don't I throw it to Rosemary Banks, the Ambassador of New Zealand to the United States. Ambassador Banks?
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui. So greetings everyone and welcome to our gathering. Thank you Greg for the invitation to start off the discussion today on the effects of COVID-19 in the Pacific. We at the New Zealand Embassy are really happy to be partnering with CSIS to bring Pacific voices on the pandemic to Washington and indeed to a wider audience. And I'd like to say thank you too to CSIS and acknowledge the long period of interest that you've had in our region through the Pacific Partners Initiative that you launched in 2011. As you know, I think it's a policy priority for New Zealand to bring attention to our region, to bring partnerships and to bring resources. So the discussion that we're going to have today is a really valuable part of raising Pacific profile and deepening understanding of what's going on there. As you likely know, the Pacific is of course really central to New Zealand foreign policy and development assistance policy. And our government in 2018 launched the Pacific Reset, which was a refresh of our policy, emphasizing deeper and more mature partnerships with our Pacific neighbors. Through that Pacific Reset, we've increased our ODA by 30%. At the same time, we've extended our diplomatic and defense presence across the Pacific. We're acutely aware of the challenges that are facing the Pacific. Those have been just recently re-identified, you might say, in the consultations that have been happening around the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, climate change, competition for marine resources, global competition, future of economies, and of course, on top of all of that now, COVID. New Zealand has provided bilateral help for the COVID response and also through the regional effort led by the WHO. And a number of other countries have also responded to help the Pacific response. We're pleased to see that the US announced an additional $200 million recently as part of its Pacific pledge. Just on a personal note, I was really fortunate earlier in my career to have a posting as Deputy High Commissioner to the Solomon Islands. And at that time, we also covered Vanuatu. And I can honestly say that was one of the most enriching and rewarding periods of my diplomatic career. The Pacific never really left me. So I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon and to hear our panelists. So time to pass back to you, Greg, for them to speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Banks. Now we're going to move without delay into our panel. In no particular order other than alphabetically, I'm going to ask Tara Kabutalaka to open up our discussion. Tara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. First, let me take the opportunity to thank CSIS and the New Zealand Embassy, and particularly Ambassador Banks, for the opportunity to participate and to contribute to this discussion. And also thank you to my colleagues, Al and Anna, for being part of this. I'm going to make some really broad comments, and then we can move on to more specific discussions. The COVID-19 pandemic has been, like other parts of the world, been devastating for Pacific Island countries in a number of ways. In terms of health issues, Pacific Island countries have been relatively safe. Out of the 11 countries that have declared no COVID-19 cases, 9 of them are Pacific Island countries. Up until about 2 weeks ago, there was 12, and 10 of them were Pacific Island countries. But then Solomon Islands has announced that it has 2 cases as of 2 weeks ago, or last week actually. But the big concern for Pacific Island countries is the lack of capacity to deal with it. If they do get cases, and if there is community infections, the most Pacific Island countries do not have the capacity to be able to deal with COVID-19. And we've seen it in cases like Papua New Guinea. Fiji has been able to control it to a certain extent. But for countries like Solomon Islands or Kiribati or Tuvalu, the only protection for a lot of this country is their island identity. Being isolated, being far away from centers of trade, from centers of population movement, and so forth. And so for a lot of countries, the response has been to shut down. And that has been the case in Fiji and other places. And in the case of Solomon Islands, the cases have come in from the repatriation of Solomon Islanders from other parts of the world. In this case, Solomon Island students studying overseas, especially in the Philippines. The most devastating impact for Pacific Island countries has been economics. The economic impact has been huge. You know, with the kind of small economy that Pacific Island countries have, and especially countries that are dependent on tourism, it's been devastating. Fiji, for instance, Palau, and Vanuatu, the economic impact of COVID-19 has been huge. In some countries, the response has been to, you know, put in place stimulus package by governments to see if that could help with the economic impact. And we've seen it in several of the Pacific Island countries. I want to focus on something quite different. So the health impact, the economic impact. There's been a lot of discussion amongst Pacific Islanders, both government as well as, you know, broader population of Pacific Islanders, on alternative development paths, on whether COVID-19 has created an opportunity for us to look for alternative ways of development, that creating new normal, that, you know, the current dependence on the global economy probably isn't the best thing for Pacific Island places. And that discussion has been going on for a while, actually since COVID-19 started. So for some countries, the response, and this is not something that is unique to to Pacific Islands. It is something that we've seen in other parts of the world. The response has been to get people out of urban centers into rural areas. In Solomon Islands, for instance, the government response initially was to charter boats to take people away from the urban centers to villages, because they thought that if you move away from the centers of population, then it would be much safer for people. But for a lot of those places, these are the places where services such as health, education are most limited or unavailable for people. And so there's been a lot of discussion among Solomon Islanders in looking at new development paths. What do we do? In these discussions, I don't think that we have found the answer to that question. What is the new development path? But at least the discussions have been taking place for a while. The other point that I want to raise is, the responses not only for Pacific Islanders in the islands, but Pacific Islanders in the diaspora, in places like Hawaii, for instance, or Aotearoa, New Zealand, or Australia. In the case of Hawaii, and Al will perhaps make comments on this. In the case of Hawaii, Pacific Island population makes up for about 4%, 5% of the population of Hawaii. But we make up for over 20% of the infections in the state. And so the question arises, how do you deal with Pacific Islander populations in the diaspora? And I'm certain it is similar in places like New Zealand or Australia. The final point I want to make is there are both bilateral as well as multilateral responses to COVID-19. So while individual countries are trying to respond to it, there's been an effort to rally countries at the regional level to see how we would respond to COVID-19. So I thought I'd make those very broad comments and then open it up to others. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Tara. I was remiss at the top. I should have reminded everybody that as with most of our Zoom webinars, we're going to do Q&A using the Q&A function on Zoom. So if you do have questions for the panel, you can wait until the Q&A, but if something comes up while one of the panelists is speaking, feel free to go ahead and write it in now and identify yourself, and we'll try to make sure that we get through as much of the queue as we can when we move into Q&A. Now with that, why don't I throw it to Al Ohlers as our next speaker. Al, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Greg. And like my colleague Tara, I'd like to acknowledge CSIS and thank CSIS for organizing this. And I'd also like to thank Ambassador Banks for the generous support from the New Zealand Embassy for this event and for gracing the occasion with opening remarks. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's deeply valued, your connection to CSIS and your support for this. And by the way, Ambassador, if you haven't come out to Hawaii yet, please consider that and put this into your work plan for the coming year. We'll be delighted to welcome you here and to host you for a visit. So we look forward to doing that. It's also great to see Tara and Anna. My goodness, when was the last time we actually got together? And can you believe this, ladies and gentlemen? Tara is less than 2.5 miles away from me. And because of the lockdowns and everything else, we haven't got together since way, way back. And this is, terrible. This is absolutely terrible. So it's really nice to connect up now and be able to see faces. And it's like the old gang being assembled and we're riding off in the sunset again, hopefully. But Tara, seriously, let's try to get together over a bowl of kava sometime and have a drink. Although I've led to understand now that the price of kava has skyrocketed, which might be one of the things we want to talk about too. That's emblematic of some of the challenges that the Pacific is facing.
It's beyond my pay now.
As Greg kind of pointed out at the introduction, I work for the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. We are a DoD agency, And as a DoD employee, I'm obliged to start my comments with a caveat that the points that I'm about to discuss are my personal views, and they are in no way reflective of US government, Defense Department, or Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies perspectives on the issues. Phew. So with that, let me try to say a few things. I think Tara kind of laid out in broad brush strokes some really important issues. And I can't pick up on all of those to amplify a little more. But what I would like to do is maybe try to do a deeper dive into one of the things that he mentioned there that is of critical significance, the economic impact, and associated with the economic impact, the attempts now to try to articulate in a visionary sense, and then maybe in a more practical sort of way, a new development path, the new normal of what the basis of development is going to be for the Pacific. And I think part of this is going to rest upon a sober diagnosis of how the COVID has hit the Pacific. Acknowledging the fact that in terms of cases, mortality statistics, and all the rest, in many respects, the Pacific has only been lightly touched by COVID, but the economic impact has been devastating. But the economic impact, if we were to be very honest, only exposed and cast into sharper relief vulnerabilities and imbalances that had already existed pre-COVID. So for example, most Pacific economies have been imbalanced with a heavy reliance on services, tourism in particular within that category, but also resources, fishing or mining. There has also been an underdevelopment of trade relationships, despite the openness of these economies. And lastly, one other thing I would highlight is there has been an underappreciation and underinvestment in what probably is the largest sector in all these countries, but goes unenumerated because it's not counted in official statistics towards GDP or anything like that. And that is the informal subsistence sector. It's huge. And when people lose their jobs in the urban sector, this is the fallback. This is where they retreat to in order to survive. And yet it has been underinvested in and not given sufficient emphasis by many governments in the pursuit of modernity, development, and so forth, characterized and defined in a different sort of way. Now, keeping that in mind, the challenge going forward is trying to articulate first and foremost, a diversification away from this sort of structural norm that currently exists. And that exists within the service sector, perhaps moving away from tourism or recharacterizing the nature of tourism so that it takes on a new shape and form. Maybe exploration of new services as well too, in the area of perhaps financial services, in the area of business services. We are talking about populations that have some of the highest levels of English language literacy, for instance, in the world. That is something to be capitalized on. There's also a need to diversify sectorally, moving away from the emphasis in services to others, such underexploited sectors in agriculture, for example, which has tended to be lost in the pursuit of development and so forth, but yet is one of the mainstays underpinning activity in many of these countries. And even in the area of mining, thinking beyond terrestrial mining towards seabed mining. I know, for instance, the Cook Islands is starting to think a little bit. There's also a need to kind of think about the engines that drive employment generation. And typically it has been services like tourism that have been the largest employment generators. But to think maybe about on a regional level, how labor markets could be tied together for a regional response. I acknowledge fully the great support of seasonal worker schemes, for instance, such as that run by Australia. But maybe there's a need to take a bolder step forward in terms of labor market integration across the Pacific to allow for mobility and the sharing of employment opportunities. Subsistence sector, I want to hit again as well too. I spoke about an underinvestment. And Tara, I think, pointed to the fact that, some governments have been encouraging a return to the rural sector. But to make that happen, it's going to take more than just putting people on boats and making them go back. There's going to be need for an actual well thought out policy about reinvigorating the subsistence sector, the informal economy, and how that can be a foundation, a bedrock for many of the other activities that happen in the more formal economy. It's not an either or choice. They can complement each other. And the challenge going forward in trying to establish the new normal is in defining the nature of that complementarity and getting the synergies necessary so that we move forward with both of these sectors together. And the last one I want to hit is trade. I think trade really has been an underexploited avenue to drive growth. There is tremendous opportunity in the Pacific in niche markets. We're not talking about mass-produced things, just niche markets, niche products, I should say, and exploiting the larger market potential of partners, for instance, the United States. Okay? And one brilliant example of this just recently that has been developed through the initiatives of US Embassy SUBA has been in the area of kava, where kava is now a major commodity in many mainland US states, and a whole market has opened up around an agricultural product with some innovation in high-tech marketing and so forth that is going to support an area that is very, very central in Fiji. So, where do the partners fit into this overall picture? I mean, there are many, many ways. There's a big picture here that the partners can jump into and play many different roles. Ambassador Banks already pointed out to the programs pursued by the New Zealand and Australian governments that are very, very supportive in this regard. And to be fair, I should say that the United States has also been playing a role, though less prominent and less noticeable. To some degree, the United States has focused on the Compact of Free Association states in the Northern Pacific, but also now with a greater diplomatic footprint across the Pacific, we are trying to do more in the area. And I thank again Ambassador Banks for drawing attention to the Pacific Pledge that started in 2019. And just recently on October 8th, we had a final meeting of 3 meetings with partners in the Pacific to roll out an additional $20 million to try to address some of the priorities in the Pacific, not just the COFA states, but writ large, through mainly the State Department, USAID, but a range of other agencies as well. And as a first, I would like to highlight in particular the contribution of the US Trade and Development Agency on the trade front to try to provide an additional locomotive to pull development forward for the Pacific. So that kind of takes me through my comments, but to kind of maybe make things a little interesting as well too, going forward. A few comments on maybe the unspoken other player in the Pacific, the People's Republic of China, and how the People's Republic of China has taken advantage of the COVID situation to advance some of its geopolitical objectives in the Pacific, and how it kind of lashes up with the Belt Road Initiative in particular, of which a number of Pacific nations have availed themselves of. To be frank, I don't see a lot of headway being made by the People's Republic of China in the Pacific, making use of that mechanism, or in terms of the economic impact as well too. I know we hear a lot of popular reporting around that. Sometimes I think it's overblown, but we do need perhaps to be concerned about that and the implications of that in terms of influence and leverage over some governments that have governance systems that are maybe prone to malign influence. So I'll kind of just plant that seed there, and maybe we can pursue it further in Q&A. I want to kind of stop there and hand over to Anna, who probably is going to speak a little bit more about the geopolitical dynamics involved in the Pacific. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thanks, Al. So our last speaker is going to be Anna Poles. Anna, take us home. You're still on mute.
You'd think that we would get this right by now. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much. I'd just like to repeat the thanks of my fellow panelists, to Greg and CSIS for having us and for hosting us today, and of course to Ambassador Banks and the New Zealand Embassy in Washington for your support as well, and long-standing support in terms of bringing the Pacific to DC. So very much appreciate that. So I'm going to follow on from Tara and Al and just expand my comments a little bit further. So I want to talk sort of about five very briefly, five sort of key lessons or key issues that have come out so far of the COVID experience in the Pacific to date. The first is the strength of Pacific regionalism and collective action, for a start. The second is the long-standing economic and severity of that, and both Tara and Al have spoken to that as well. The third is the role of external parties like Australia and New Zealand particularly, and particularly given the fact that both Australia and New Zealand recalibrated their foreign policies and they put their policies towards the Pacific region under the Step Up and the Reset, and what that means for future engagement. The fourth point is in respect to what COVID-19 tells us about how the Pacific is responding to other crises and those implications. And the fourth touches on whether or not strategic competition has accelerated or amplified in the region, and whether or not it has been as disruptive as perhaps we originally thought it could be. So with respect to regionalism, in April this year, the Pacific Islands Forum established under the Foreign Ministers, established the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway on COVID-19. And this was the regional response. And this really reflected, and the way that the Pacific Islands Forum and the Pacific at the regional level has responded really reflects the fact that collective action, regionalism is where the resilience in the region lies at that level, and it's very much a buffer in many respects. Dame Meg Taylor, the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, made the comment at the time that if there was ever a time within where the region and its partners need to work together, now was it, with the immediate threat to the lives of our people across the Blue Pacific region. And this reflects, even though we haven't fortunately seen the same health impact of COVID-19, the economic impact has had devastating consequences at the socioeconomic levels as well. So the Pacific Humanitarian Pacific Humanitarian Pathway exemplifies this regional action that we've seen the Pacific engage in successfully in the past, whether it be nuclear testing, oceans governance, political crises, for instance, in terms of regional responses to political crises, as well as the geopolitical environment itself in terms of expanding the concept of security as was laid out in the 2018 Boy Declaration. So the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway on COVID-19 captures these strengths of regionalism and the importance that regionalism plays in the Pacific. And this is particularly important for partners to the region, that regionalism is not undermined or eroded in the efforts of other countries, other partners to engage with the Pacific as well. And we have seen this happen at various times. Importantly too, the Pacific is the only region which has adopted a regional kind of collective action in the same way. So there's an awful lot to be heralded about the way that the Pacific has responded to this. And that very much reflects a deep sense of what the implications for the region are, and the importance of collective action. And this is where the economic element comes into this. And I won't spend too much time here because Tara and Al talked about this as well. But essentially, as we know, tourism is the principal economic driver for a number of Pacific countries, and we've seen significant impact. Fiji and Vanuatu, the GDP has fallen and will continue to fall by around 50%. A number of countries have adopted stimulus packages as a consequence of that. And Fiji's Reserve Bank has estimated that the economy is going to contract by 21.7% this year. And next year, there are serious concerns as well across the region in terms of what this is going to look like. The economic impact and the loss of jobs and the displacement as well, either voluntary or otherwise, that has occurred in some countries, has also led to a lot of other economic issues too. We've seen significant increases in domestic violence, for example, in Fiji. We've seen significant increases in low-level criminality. We've seen the potential and increasing rise of illicit actors seeking to take advantage of these situations. So there's the economic element to one has driven a lot of these other impacts as well. So Australia and New Zealand's response to COVID-19 in the Pacific has been very much framed in the context of the Pacific Step Up and the New Zealand's Pacific Reset strategies. But it's also provided, as other panelists have also alluded to, an opportunity to actually refocus efforts to support economic recovery in ways which far more reflect needs and priorities and drivers in Pacific countries, and perhaps step away from the prioritization of projects and engagement which speaks to the geopolitical concerns that Australia and New Zealand have had in the region, but providing this an opportunity to kind of shift the trajectory a little bit and actually engage in those areas which have been underfunded and overlooked for a long period of time. The health sector, for instance, is one of those, but there are other areas as well. I'll mention trade too, and there's increasing calls within the Pacific for Pacific leaders to sign and ratify PACER Plus, which is the regional free trade agreement with the Pacific Island countries, Australia and New Zealand. And there has been some long-standing kind of concerns over PACER Plus because of some of the non-binding elements to it with respect to labour. But there's obviously some good work that could be done there at this time. And again, this creates an opportunity to do that. The third point rather is the fact that COVID-19, we've seen this very strong regional response, and it really has amplified the other threats as well. The Fijian Prime Minister, Bainimarama, made a comment in the last couple of weeks that the Pacific Island countries are facing a dual crisis, and as a consequence, both COVID-19, but also climate change as well. And that in the process of addressing COVID-19, we can't forget and ignore the importance of keeping the pressure on with respect to climate change issues. And Dame Meg Taylor from the Forum has reiterated these comments in a number of different fora. She said most recently with the Forum Foreign Ministers meeting being held this week, she said that yes, the crisis should serve as a wake-up call for our region, but we will continue to face a more pressing challenge, the existential threat of climate change and its related impacts. So we've seen a situation where COVID-19 has, as Al mentioned, sort of pulled back the curtain on a number of existing weaknesses, but these are weaknesses which climate change was already amplifying. And this is, COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to actually consider how we can then respond to the threat of climate change in a far more structural way. Now, this obviously speaks to the concerns that are captured in terms of the Pacific Islands Forum 2050 Blue Pacific strategy, which Ambassador Banks mentioned at the outset, and the vision that the Pacific has for its future and for the future of the region. And this is again where there's opportunity had here to reconsider how partners have engaged with the region in order to address these threats like COVID-19, but most importantly, climate change as well. Strategic competition, the last point I'm just going to make to dovetail off Al's points about Chinese engagement in the region, there was a great deal sort of a sense that COVID-19 would sort of precipitate global geopolitical competition in the Pacific, that it would be some kind of geopolitical game changer in the region. And it hasn't. actually. It has amplified certain dynamics and has revealed some new trends, but it certainly hasn't been the game changer that potentially thought it might be. That said, though, we're not out of the woods yet with respect to COVID-19. So there's a long path ahead, and that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. So when the COVID-19 pandemic broke earlier this year, in an article, I wrote about that COVID-19 had several front lines in the Pacific, both health security and economic, but also a potential sort of geopolitical front would open up as well in terms of China and increased contestation for influence in the Pacific. And that hasn't actually been the case at all, even though that we've seen Chinese efforts with respect to so-called sort of mask diplomacy, their actual in cash as opposed to in kind, the actual in cash assistance to the Pacific has been relatively low. They have initially sought to kind of shape and control the pandemic narrative in the Pacific, including privately seeking to influence decisions made by Pacific Island governments with respect to calling back students from China, but also leveraging this a form of kind of sort of emotional blackmail, kind of pitching the crisis as a friendship test and using its economic weight to discourage countries from closing their borders, as we saw in the Solomon Islands, for example. But it hasn't actually been that overly significant to date. And that really brings me back to my first point about the importance of regionalism and the strength of regionalism. And Dame Meg made the point at the very outset when the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway was established, that it was about all partners, all of the Pacific partners working together, whether they be Australian or New Zealand or US or China or others, and that this was an opportunity to strengthen rather than to see this as an opportunity to divide. And this is where we need to be very mindful of what Pacific leaders are saying with respect to how they want engagement and partnership to look like going forward. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. We're gonna hop into the queue. And again, I'd encourage anybody who has a question, please go ahead and identify yourselves so the speakers know who they're responding to. Before I move to the first audience question, I thought I'd follow up on a couple points made by the speakers, partially out of my own curiosity, and whoever wants to field them, please do so. Picking up on Anna's point about strategic competition, because this is clearly a lens through which Washington is going to think about this. And I wonder, you know, if you look at the statements coming out of USAID, it is, you know, the U.S. is being a great partner. It's dumping well over $100 million into the Pacific in COVID-19 aid. And what's hidden, as Al suggests, is that that's overwhelmingly going to the 3 compact states, which has been consistent with messaging we've seen for the last several years around the U.S. in an effort to kind of shore up influence in the compact states. How does that, you know, how do we explain the kind of bifurcation of an enormous amount of U.S. assistance to 3 states and a perception by the rest of the Pacific that the U.S. is basically missing, that the U.S. has not been engaged in COVID-19 at all? Because I think that really needs to be understood by U.S. policymakers, that when they say we are stepping up in the Pacific, not to steal a term from our friends across the sea, that's not being felt in 90% of the Pacific. And the other question I had, maybe for Al or Tara, you both talked about the economic impacts quite a bit, and I think the impact on tourism is pretty self-evident. But the other one that was only mentioned briefly is fishing. And I don't think it's very well understood globally, not just in the US, right? How the COVID-19 pandemic has severely impacted fishing. I mean, around the world, but in a place like the Pacific especially. If anybody could pull at that a little bit and why this has been such a major problem for the fisheries industry. Anna, do you want to start off maybe?
With respect to fisheries?
No, with respect to the question about competition and you know, the U.S. being perceived as missing, even though the U.S. seems to think that it's doing a lot in the Pacific.
Okay, so I think it's important to acknowledge that the US has increased its engagement significantly under the Pacific Pledge, and that it has taken some time to sort of marry up various different narratives and between sort of Indo-PACOM and State Department in Washington, the Indo-PACOM out of Hawaii. And so that has taken some time, but certainly you're absolutely right. The US is perceived to be far more heavily involved, not surprisingly, in the 3 COFA states in the North Pacific, and its engagement in the southern part of the Pacific, in our part of the world, has been less visible, although it has been increasing as well, largely through much more sort of security-focused engagements as well. And it's certainly seen a step up with respect to that. It's hard not to use the Australian term when talking about all of this. So we've seen that, but then of course with the announcement of the Peace Corps again in the Pacific, and then returning to the Pacific, and then with respect to the Millennium Challenge Fund as well in the Solomon Islands. So there has been, you know, an increase, but still that visibility is relatively low, and it always comes as some surprise to many that when we talk about geostrategic competition in the Pacific, and we talk about how Pacific Island countries are responding, and the fact that they're really kind of hedging Australia and China as opposed to the United States and China, simply because Australia is the largest presence in the Pacific and is the most important. And I think a recent survey that CSIS did, which included a section on Fiji, was really telling in terms of which countries the Fijian officials in the security space believed, when they ranked the various different countries, who was of the most significant in terms of both economic influence but also political influence. And certainly Australia and China and New Zealand ranked relatively high, and the US consistently ranked quite low on the list. So I think these kind of things are quite telling, and certainly I think it's important to note too that the way that the US engages with the North Pacific states and the issues there in terms of self-determination, in terms of militarization, in terms of and climate change, those are watched by the rest of the region as well, and so there's also that degree of credibility there too.
Thank you for promoting our elite survey. I should have done it myself. You're right. I think respondents were asked to rate the top 3 most influential countries in their system, and everywhere else that the survey was asked, it was some combination of China, US, and Japan, and US and Japan couldn't even break the top 3 in Fiji. So, Al, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think Anna's kind of covered it a lot, but I would kind of say that, you know, if we were to fault ourselves on the United States side, I think maybe on the strategic messaging side, we can do better. And that's an issue of coordination around the information flow to enable that message, and then broadcasting that message as well too. I'm sure you're very aware over in Washington, D.C., that there is a lot of noise in the traffic of information and the strategic communications and so on and so forth. And very, very often when it relates to strategic competition, it is big ticket, big banner sort of issues that get silhouetted first and foremost, and commitments in geographic areas that are less contentious, that are not paid sufficient attention to, and certainly the US engagement in that area that tend to get lost in all that traffic and noise. So, you know, if we compare this to, for example, Southeast Asia, where there is a lot of friction, tension, confrontation, if you like, in terms of strategic competition. If you compare this to South Asia, for example, where there's a very important dynamic associated with relationship with India and the other issues that are playing out in South Asia, you probably would get the kind of messages that we need to get out in the Pacific coming through the bandwidth. However, it's different in the Pacific. It is sort of still looked upon as an area where strategic competition is not as sharp as it is felt in other geographic areas, and consequently, we don't pay too much attention to that. I would just offer a very quick comment on the issue of fishing and how COVID has impacted that. It's primarily through supply chains. And if you remember that all of these Pacific nations shut down completely, that completely also disrupted the supply chains associated with the fishing industry. So associated with suspension of flights, shipping, and so on and so forth, the fishing industry was also strangled in that process. Second factor to kind of point out too is that even when there has been a revival of fishing, what many of the Pacific nations are finding out right now is that their rate of return on the catch is diminishing. And the reason for this is that in this current context right now, some countries have taken advantage to expand their fishing fleets and to move them much further afield, offshore, into previously unexploited areas, and to intensify their catch in those areas. I think everybody would have heard about the recent sort of issues around the Galapagos and the massive Chinese fishing fleet that parked itself out there for a period of time and caused no end of consternation among our South American friends and partners out there. But what many of the Pacific nations are finding out that even when they revive the industry and get a catch, the rate of return on that catch is diminishing, and they're not getting as much as they used to, which probably speaks to, in the future, a need to define a sustainability algorithm around this in the Pacific. But if you're constantly being undercut by other long distance fishing fleets from other nations, you have to really kind of have a sober assessment of the place of fishing within your overall new development agenda if you're articulating one. And by the way, much of the data for the declining returns on the fishing catch is coming from the Pew Charitable Trust. I would like to put in a plug for them because that's brilliant work in terms of trying to work out what's really happening in the fishing industry. I'll stop there and Tara can add more.
Thanks, Al. Tara, if you would like to address those questions, feel free. I also want to throw one more question at you from the queue so we can start moving through it. So we have a question from Jacob Stern, who's a master's student at Georgetown, who asked whether or not there's any risk of increased political instability anywhere in the Pacific resulting from COVID-19. I mean, one you mentioned early in your remarks, Solomons, for instance. There's certainly other places in the region in which I imagine COVID-19 could hypothetically increase tensions, movements toward autonomy, et cetera. So any thoughts?
Thank you, Greg. Very, very quickly, in terms of US involvement in the Pacific, as you mentioned, and others have mentioned, the focus has been on the Northern Pacific. But like Anna said, the US has also been increasing its involvement in other parts of the Pacific Islands. The interesting thing is that not only the messaging that the US has, but the way in which it packages its involvement in the rest of the Pacific. And the thing is, the countries like the United States, in the case of the South Pacific, does not have to be involved in the same way that it is involved in the Northern Pacific to have an impact. For instance, in the case of Solomon Islands, very recently, the US, through its strengthening competitiveness, agriculture, livelihood, and environment program, gave Solomon Islands, to Malaita province in particular, $25 million. And that has a lot of impact, both in terms of the image that the US has in places like Solomon Islands or in other parts of the Pacific Islands. I think one of the issues that we should consider is how that has an impact on domestic politics. And that leads to the question that you raised about internal political stability, whether assistance from outside, whether it's from China or the United States. The question is, how does it impact domestic politics and the potential for conflict, not only violent conflict, but other forms of conflict between central governments and provincial governments or between different parts of the country. And I think that's something that's important to consider, not only for the US, but for other countries like China or Australia and New Zealand. In terms of political instability, there's always a potential for that in some parts of the Pacific. I'm not sure how extensive it is, but in places like Papua New Guinea, for instance, or Solomon Islands, there has always been a potential for internal political instability as a result of COVID-19. And a lot of that is from the economic impact, the inability of governments to address the economic impact of COVID-19.
Thank you. Let me bundle a few questions together that are related to the issue of development pathways, which both Tara and Al raised. So Dennis Delgado from US Indo-PACOM asks how multilateral organizations can best help support this move toward new development paths that Al had addressed. And a similar question came from April Ingham, who's with Pacific Peoples Partnership in Canada, who asking how can external partners in North America support Pacific organizations, grassroots organizations, and peoples in trying to pivot toward new development pathways as we move out of the COVID-19 crisis, hopefully in the relatively near future. Whoever wants to pick that one up first.
I'll make a few comments, maybe provoking even further comments on this. And I think what I like to say is I think there are very important roles for international partners to play in helping articulate the vision, the values, and the principles that would guide the development of this new alternative development path. Particularly into directions, fostering greater inclusiveness, representation, and also meeting the needs of the people, broadly speaking, on the ground, as opposed to being a top-down driven sort of approach. Because governance is such a challenge in many Pacific nations. I think moral and material support in holding the line, in insisting on these foundational sort of principles guiding the development of this new vision will be very important. And best practices and learning from other nations as they have tried in their own way, successfully or not so successfully, to try to move in this direction. From my point of view, personally, I think this is a very, very important fresh initiative from the Pacific for themselves to grab things by the collar and say, you know what, we've had a reckoning and we feel we want to move forward with a new development path. And I say this primarily because of the opportunity it presents us, broadly speaking, United States, Australia, New Zealand, France, other partners across the world that are interested in the Pacific and interested in sort of values that I've just articulated that resonate in the Pacific and are foundational in the Pacific themselves. It offers all of us an opportunity to distinguish an approach in contrast to something such as that driven by the Belt Road Initiative. So strategically, there's a very important aspect to this whole point of thinking. What is being articulated right now in the Pacific is fundamentally at odds with some of the basic principles of Belt Road Initiative, driven as it is in terms of scale, as well as basic ethos about what development means. They're night and day. So there's a very strong opportunity for us to support this new initiative coming through in the Pacific. And I know I'm not offering a concrete answer to the question posed, but I just wanted to situate the broader significance of this. And I hope my colleagues on the panel will be able to amplify a little more. I'll pause there.
Thanks. Well, it was hardly an easy question. So, Tara, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, if I may jump in very quickly and add to what Al said, so there's been a lot of discussion, as Al mentioned and others have mentioned, in the Pacific Islands and amongst Pacific Islanders about, alternative development paths. A lot of it is happening outside of state discussions. It's happening in places like the Pacific Theological College, for instance. The University of the South Pacific have rallied people for months since COVID-19 started. And that's on record, actually. A lot of the webinar discussions are recorded. And, I think 3 publications have come out of that discussion. And it's looking at, what are the things that Pacific Island countries should emphasize on. And I'll mention the fact that, subsistence sector has become important. And that's true for some Pacific Island countries, but not all the Pacific Island countries. But it also has its challenges. Some of the challenges is that, in the past 3 or so decades, we've seen a lot of Pacific Islanders shift to urban areas. And a lot of new generation of Pacific Islanders who no longer have the kinds of skills that would support them in the subsistence sector. And so it raises the question of education. What kind of education do we need for Pacific Islanders to be able to survive in the subsistence sector in the way that their ancestors have? And so critical discussions about education and what kind of people we are trying to train for the future in the Pacific. And so countries like Australia and New Zealand and the US, investment in education would be really, really important. And this could be also framed around issues of security as well, that education that would then engender security for those places. There are also other discussions in terms of subsistence as well. What we've seen is that we've seen land reforms that have alienated Pacific Islanders from land. And so even if we talk about subsistence, there is a population of Pacific Islanders who no longer have access to land in the way that their grandparents have. And so there are challenges associated with that as well. And there is another discussion that was going on for months that is not on record, but has involved Pacific Islanders from all over the place, including some Pacific Island leaders. And that's a Talanoa discussion organized by a couple of individuals from Fiji and Tonga that happened for at least 2 months, that included people in New Zealand, in the US, within the Pacific, Australia, and from all over the world. And so there's a lot of discussion about alternative paths to development. My thought is that, in spite of that discussion, and Al is absolutely right, that we haven't come up with concrete ideas on what this alternative path is. We've had a lot of discussions, but we haven't pinned down what is the alternative path for development for Pacific Island countries.
Thank you, Tara. We're running short on time, but I really want to get in a couple thoughts on one last question, and maybe I can impress on Anna the duty of responding, if you don't mind. So Alan Tidwell asked about the possibility of COVID vaccine diplomacy becoming a problem in the Pacific. And we've heard far more discussion about this so far, I think, in places like Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, where access to Western vaccines seems unlikely given, that the Americans, the Koreans, the Japanese, other Europeans have bought them up. And so there's fears that at the end of the day, China and Russia will be the only alternatives. We also have this effort by WHO, Australia, among others, to support the Gavi Alliance. Is it going to be possible in a timely manner for Pacific Island states to get access to a vaccine that they can afford that will allow them to start reopening economies?
Thanks, Greg. Both Australia and New Zealand have made commitments around the vaccine and the Pacific Islands and ensuring that the Pacific Islands are supported. So in many respects, I actually think some of the biggest challenges are actually going to be distribution within those Pacific Island countries themselves. So certainly at the current time, the vaccine issue is not necessarily seen as one as being as contentious as perhaps elsewhere, given the Australian New Zealand commitments.
Great. Well, it's good to end these on a bit of good news that seems to happen uncomfortably rarely on at least the panels that I host of late. So with that, we are a couple minutes over time. Let me thank Al and Anna and Tara for taking the time to join the panel. Thank you, Ambassador Banks, for giving us your valuable time, and to the Embassy for your support. And thanks especially to everybody who tuned in for this important discussion. I know we didn't get through all the questions. We never do. That's my fault more than anybody else's. Please go ahead and send them to us by email, over social media, and we will do our best to respond. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and please stay safe.